Hey guys, welcome to Amity Tracks, and welcome to this fourth and final video in this Van Morrison series we've been doing. And it's been a lot of fun. Actually, a lot more fun than I anticipated. I've been a Van Morrison fan, well, since about 1990, because of an album we're going to discuss in this video. Yeah, but you know how it is. If you have a decent collection, you follow a lot of artists. You go in and out, and kind of don't listen to an artist for long stretches of time. And it's kind of been that way with Van Morrison, and it's been a lot of fun sort of diving back in preparation for and doing these videos. So hope you guys have been enjoying them. I've had great comments. Really been enjoying the comments on each of these videos. Those have been fun discussions. But in case you missed the other videos, just real quick, the first video was an introduction to Van Morrison, talking about some of the controversial issues surrounding Van Morrison, and I quickly talked about them, his first band that got recognition. And then the previous two videos were, ranking the studio albums from the 20th century, and so 26 albums, and yeah, that was a lot of fun. So this final video here, we need to talk about live albums and compilations. Now, do not think this is just sort of a cleanup, kind of picking up the scraps video in this series. Very important stuff. If I had been including live albums in that ranking, it's probably two of these that probably would have been in the top 10. I mean, essential live material and essential compilations too. So I think this is going to be an interesting discussion. Um, we'll start with the live material. Van has been a notorious performer through most of his career, right? He is one of those artists where you got to catch him on the right night. Now I'm going to say I have never actually seen Van Morrison live. I mean, I've watched a lot of material on YouTube, and I've got these live albums, read a lot about his performance history, but I've never actually seen him live. He doesn't come down here to Texas all that often, so yeah, I have missed out on that. But yeah, I mean, I've listened to a lot of live material, and you read about it, and there's volumes written about how Van Morrison is a very kind of mercurial performer, right? You catch him on an off night, um, he's just going through the motions. Sometimes doesn't even acknowledge the audience. Gets on, does a show, and leaves. It's a job. Other nights, it can be like transcendent. He can be one of the greatest performers ever. It just depends on the night you get him, and yeah, it's he's long had that reputation. Well, this first live album, his first official live album, caught him on some very on nights. It's Too Late to Stop Now from 1974. Really, kind of capping off that whole 68 to 74 run, that initial run that is rivals anybody's run. This is sort of the culmination. Now, I know Vita and Fleece comes right after this, which is part of that run as well. But other than Vita and Fleece, everything kind of came before leading up to this. And yeah, I mean, what do you say about this? Most of you guys know about this album. Critically, many critics view it as one of the greatest live albums ever. I agree with that. I think this is one of the greatest live albums ever. This was with, I think, probably his most storied band, the Caledonia Soul Orchestra, which is just probably his most sympathetic band. I mean, the band that was really in tune with him, at a peak period for Van Morrison. And and such a versatile group. I mean, it's you have the guitar and the bass and the drums and the piano in there, but you have some strings in there, you have some horns in there, so gave him a lot of colors to work with, musical colors, and he definitely used them. I do want to mention, just while I'm thinking about it, I think it was 2016. There was a deluxe. Well, not really even a deluxe edition. Well, because what was interesting in that release, basically, there was a box set that expanded on these shows. I think it was released 2016. Going off my memory, but I think it was around then. And what's interesting about that box set is it actually does not include the original, like most box sets do, right? when they expand on stuff, doesn't include the original version of this, but it's they were titled Volume 2, Volume 3, Volume 4, so they were, kind of extensions of this, just more performances from that tour. Although I think a lot of the performances that are on here were sort of, resequenced and put in, on the right discs of because each disc covered like a particular night or whatever. And then there's a DVD in there as well. This is back in the days of when I was using iTunes all the time, but I downloaded it, and then burned it onto CDs. So I have the Volume 2, Volume 3, Volume 4. I don't have the DVD. I don't know. In hindsight, I do kind of wish, that I had went ahead and bought the real deal, but it's kind of expensive and hard to find nowadays. But anyway, that's out there. But that aside, I mean, this is enough. This is just transcendently great. And a couple of things, that were so great about it. Like I mentioned, the band just totally in tune with Van. I was reading interesting stories about how there were some interviews with some of the guys that were in this band talking about how he would give these cues, like behind his back, with hand signals and stuff, like, when to bring it down, and then, when he's about ready to explode again, and they were just on it. I mean, this band. And, of course, this album has a lot of his great originals on there. Well, let's talk about the covers. I'm usually a little wary of too many covers, by any artist that I admire as an artist with his own great songwriting. But I mean, Van Morrison has always been really into the soul and the blues and jazz and all those core influences on his stuff, and he does a lot of these kind of soul and blues covers on here. There's Bobby Bland and Ray Charles and Sam Cooke, Sonny Boy Williamson, Muddy Waters, covers by all those guys. I'm going to make a bold statement here, and this is very rare where this happens. When artists are covering like those soul classics, those blues classics, to me, they rarely match or outdo the originals. I mean, go to the source, go to Muddy Waters, go to Sam Cooke. This is one of those rare occasions where Van matches, I think, the originals, and in some cases surpasses them. And that's a bold statement. But take "Bring It On Home," the Sam Cooke song. That is just listen to that song carefully. You talk about like cues to the band, and the band is just totally in tune. And he brings it way down, and then he's on a dime. They do what he wants. And he is locked into the soul of that song. I mean, it's just stunning. I believe to my soul. I believe the Ray Charles song is another one where I think he outdoes the original. I don't say that lightly. I'm a big fan of, especially the blues artists. I have a lot of their material. I listen to it a lot. I don't consider myself a dilettante in those genres. Um, but I got to say, at least here, Van reaches that level. And in some cases, I think surpasses it. But also, the originals on here. It's kind of interesting, the flow of this album. It starts off good, but as it progresses really into that, really this, it's a double album. So on that second record, I think is where it really reaches that other level. Um, Bring It On Home, like I said, St. Dominic's Preview is great. Listen to The Lion. He just goes even deeper into that song than on the on the studio version, if you can believe it. I mean, it's just so great. Um, Even pull out a couple great Them songs. Here Comes the Night, Gloria are great on here. Here Comes the Night. I've always really liked that song. There's a moment in here where it's peak Van Morrison, where he's about to go back into the chorus and where he just lets out this, he just goes, "Good God!" It just launches into the chorus. I mean, just like totally taken with the music. So amazing. And closing the final side with Caravan and Cypress Avenue. Um, and I think the Cypress Avenue on here outdoes the Astral Weeks version. It's just so great. And you talk about Van Morrison kind of being a temperamental artist and not really connecting with the audience sometimes. Here he does. He's playful. I mean, he kind of plays with the audience on it. Even jokes around with them a little bit. I believe it's in Cypress Avenue. Although I know the line, "Turn it up." is in Caravan all the time. But I think this moment's actually in Cypress Avenue where um, Van brings it way down, where it's just barely audible, because he's been kind of playing with the dynamics the whole song, and you can, hear some doofus in the audience basically, he shouts out, turn it up. And I love Van Morrison's response. He's just like, it's turned up already. I mean, it's like, shut up, I know what I'm doing. I mean, it's so awesome, so awesome. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Van Morrison does have this reputation, but you go look on YouTube. There's plenty of live footage of him. I've come across some videos where I dare say he seems to be in a jaunty mood and jokes with the audience. He's not always a curmudgeon, but he's got to catch him on the right night. So anyway, like I said, this you guys know this. This is essential. I mean, this is one of the great live albums ever. And I think it really captures that 70s spirit, much like this next record, which some of you guys might not be as familiar with. I think really captures the 80s. He released that in 74. And then this one here comes out, was it 83, I think? Yeah, 83. I always have to read the title because it's kind of Live at the Grand Opera House, Belfast. I don't know why I always have trouble with that title, but this, at least sort of captures that early '80s, peak. I think. Now, it's no surprise I love this album, this live album, because I think at least half of the songs on here are from Beautiful Vision. And if you watched my top 10 video last time, you saw how I feel about Beautiful Vision. It makes sense that I would love that so many of those tracks are on here. What's cool about this is he's not stuck in the past. If you look at all the tracks, the songs on this live album, they're all from like 1979 to 83. I mean, he's really about the present and what he's doing now, and not just playing the greatest hits. I mean, the only older song on here, there's like about a 30-second snippet from Into the Mystic, that kind of opens things. But other than that, it is, current at the time music of his. I appreciate that. It's interesting. Dweller on the Threshold. They talked about how that was a favorite song of mine, on Beautiful Vision, and just a favorite Van Morrison song of mine. It's kind of interesting. He takes that song at about like twice the tempo on here is from the original. It's a very different feeling song. I like both versions. I really like this version, but it's very different from that studio version. It's a different vibe. Now, does he reach the peaks that he reaches on It's Too Late to Stop Now? I think there's only one song where he reaches that level, and that's Rave On John Donne and Rave On Part 2. And it's really that Part 2 that gets tacked on where he kind of reached that transcendent level. That's a cool song. The studio version is pretty subdued, and he starts off with that kind of basically that studio arrangement on here, but then he lets the band just cut loose on the second half, and that's where I think he reaches that transcendent level. But yeah, I mean, this love this album, because again, I think it really captures, just like It's Too Late to Stop Now captures sort of that 70s vibe in a live setting. This does capture at least the early 80s, in that live setting. Much like his next live album captures kind of the mid 90s and beyond, which is A Night in San Francisco, which is, when did this come out? Well, 1994. 1994. And I'm going to be honest. I mean, there's some good stuff on here. I don't love this record, and I think it's indicative of sort of some of his style from the mid '90s onward, really leaning into that sort of mid tempo, R&B, and although a lot of jazz influence on here too. Where he does a lot of medleys and leans, to a lot of covers, kind of those classic stuff, but it doesn't reach the level as It's Too Late to Stop Now. I mean, he definitely does a lot of his original stuff on here too, but I don't know. To me, this is indicative of sort of where he was headed, musically. One other live album. I know he's got some other ones. The Skiffle Sessions I don't have. Live in Belfast with Lonnie Donegan and Chris Barber. I don't have that one. And I know I think there was a Austin City Limits release. Anyway, some other things. But I want to talk about one other live album real quick. And it's this. This was put out 2009, and Astral Weeks. This was kind of a one time deal where at the Hollywood Bowl he basically put a band together and played Astral Weeks all the way through. And I think this is really great, really great. And what's cool about this is Van does what I appreciate, what I really appreciate artists, when they do this live. He doesn't just recreate, note for note the studio versions. Well, one, it's impossible to do with Astral Weeks. That was a one-time thing that you cannot recreate, and wisely he doesn't try to. And he really kind of plays with it. Plays with the arrangements, even reorders it. So it's not even played in the same order. And I don't know if he did this intentionally, but something I noticed on here is he really plays with the tempos. He it's almost like he inverted everything. And again, I don't know if it was intentional, but it just worked out that way. But songs that were kind of the slower songs on Astral Weeks, he takes them a little faster here. And then the songs that were faster on Astral Weeks, he slows them down. I think it's very interesting. Like a great jazz musician, really kind of plays with the material. It's a living thing. Look, is that a smile? It's a smile I see on Van Morrison's face. Looks like he's actually enjoying himself. Anyway, if you are a fan of Astral Weeks, I think it doesn't replace it, obviously, but this is a fantastic companion piece to Astral Weeks. All right, moving on to compilations. Let's talk about compilations. Now, Van Morrison wasn't interested in putting together greatest hits and best ofs. I mean, for decades. His first official compilation is 1990. We're talking over 2 decades into a hugely prolific career, right? And that was this Best of Van Morrison, released in 1990. This is an incredibly important record in his history. So I want to talk about this record. But this is one of these rare occasions I'm going to tell you, do not buy the vinyl. No. If you're going to get this, you need the CD. And, well, it's good news because it's a lot cheaper. You can probably find it used, all kinds of places. The reason being is there are 4 additional tracks on the CD that didn't make it onto the vinyl, yes, for space reasons or whatever. I don't know why. They should have just expanded, the vinyl on to 2 records, but they didn't. And so they cut 4 songs that are on the CD that are not on the vinyl. And those 4 songs are essential to this whole thing. Really essential, actually. I mean, so much so that I actually didn't even know. I was so excited because I've been wanting this. I had the CD. This is my CD that I bought, in 1990 when it came out, and I've been wanting to find it on vinyl forever. I saw it. I was like, I just grabbed it and paid for it. Went home, put it on, and I'm like, wait, where's Dweller on the Threshold? Where's Queen of the Slipstream? Where's Full Force Gale? And where's Wonderful Remark? Those are on here, but they ain't on that. And they are essential to the flow of this. Especially Wonderful. Yeah. I've talked about Dweller on the Threshold a lot. It's one of my favorite Van Morrison songs. Wonderful Remark, especially when this was put out. It's since it's showed up on other comps, but it was a very hard to find song because it wasn't on any of his records. It was a song that was on the soundtrack to Martin Scorsese's film King of Comedy. And because Robbie Robertson was doing the music for that film, and Robbie and Van were real good friends, and so Van contributed a song to that. And Wonderful Remark is a great Van Morrison song. I mean, just fantastic. It is a gem, and this was the only place you could get it, but that's one of the tunes that they didn't put on the vinyl, which is crazy. So yeah, you've got to get the CD. Let's talk about this. 20 songs. This shouldn't be as great as it is. I think this is one of the greatest compilations ever. And it was huge for his career. This came out, and it's funny because he wanted nothing to do with this. He didn't participate at all. This was just put together by the record company and put out. He thought it was a waste of time. He didn't care about greatest hits and all that. This totally revitalized his career. This, to this day, is still the biggest selling record in his whole catalog. It is actually, I was reading the stats on this. This is actually one of the biggest selling records of the 1990s, period. And it was huge. And I was reading some review of this that was saying, yeah, he might not have cared about it at the outset, but he's really enjoyed the royalty checks rolling in as a result of this. So much so that he definitely participates in the follow-ups to this. But let's talk about this first. Um, this shouldn't be as good as it is. It's 20 tracks. Van didn't participate at all, no input. It's not chronological. I mean, it plays almost randomly. Yeah, I mean, you got "Baby Please Don't Go," this great rockin' them track from the mid 1960s, and then the next track is "Have I Told You Lately?" It's like that. That's a jarring transition there. This There is something magical. This totally works. I mean, does it have? Of course, it's missing. There's no Into the Mystic. There's no Saint Dominic's preview. On one disc, you can't put everything. So it's missing some essential stuff. But what is here is just great. And yeah, Tupelo Honey's not on here either, but it doesn't matter. What is here is great. It is a fantastic sampling of, you got the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, up to this was put out in 1990, right? So up to this point. And as much as one disc with 20 tracks can, it really gives you a fantastic overview of Van Morrison. I actually tried to find who was the person, who was the intern, or whoever the hell, was charged with sequencing this thing, and it's brilliant. I mean, really, but it shouldn't work because it's not chronological. It's not, I don't know, but this is what got me on board. I bought this along with everybody else. Obviously, if it's one of the best-selling discs of the '90s, and this is what hooked me. Because on the same album, you've got Gloria, like a quintessential garage '60s, classic, and Dweller on the Threshold. And I remember getting into this record, and I was like, this is the same artist. I've got to look further into this. Obviously, I've never looked back. So this is brilliant. The CD though, because those 4 tracks that are not on the vinyl, it's a crime. I mean, I don't know why they haven't re-released, maybe a record store day or something, like a double album version of this, on vinyl with the full track listing. It's a no-brainer to me. But Van Morrison, I think, realized how great that was. And so he is very involved in volume 2 of The Best of Van Morrison, which came out in 93. So, 3-4 years later. Van Morrison actually assembled this personally. And it's definitely kind of idiosyncratic, right? It's so weird. Every track on here is from the 80s, except for 2, which are 2 them tracks from, the mid 60s that, didn't make it on volume 1. It's like, what? I mean, there were, I told you, Tupelo Honey and Into the Mystic and St. Dominic's Preview. All those were left off. He didn't bother to put that on volume 2, which would kind of make sense. But what this does is this does serve as a decent kind of sampler of the 80s. Now, I don't agree with all of his choices. I think he left off some essential stuff from the 80s. Don't get me wrong. But it still is a pretty good kind of get a feel for that decade, really, with this. And then he also personally put together a volume 3 of The Best of Van Morrison, which kind of picks up with the 90s and on. When did this come out? This came out 2007, so up to 2007. This one is really kind of straight. It's a double disc. He seems to really want to focus on a lot of duets, and there's a lot of rarities on here, which kind of makes it collectible. I mean, there's tracks that he had given to different charity albums and stuff, that weren't on his records, harder to find. So it's a good sort of collection of that. So yeah, I mean, it's good, but again, I don't think this era of material is as strong. So do I listen to this very much? No, but I'm glad I have it. I mean, I want to get to Philosopher Stone. We'll get to that in a second. But there are some other good, just sort of traditional comps out there. Still on top. I don't know where my booklet is, but I got the 3 CD version. Kind of takes the same approach as that best of, where it's not sequenced chronologically. It's kind of random. For some reason, the sequencing on this one though, it's kind of a slog at times. I don't recommend this one as much as the best of volume 1, volume 2. Really, I think are great to have. Um, what else? I don't own them, but I was the track listing on the Essential Van Morrison is real solid. That would be a good collection. Yeah. So there's one what at the movies, I think, where it just collects the stuff, songs of his that were used in films. And actually, I think Wonderful Remarks on there, and it's actually a nice listen. I was looking at the track listing on that. So just kind of wrap up here. A couple other comps. This is the Bang Masters. So this is the talked about this in the second video when we were talking about his debut, Blowing Your Mind, and his whole dispute with Burt Burns, and then Burt Burns' widow, and trying to get out of that contract with Bang Records. Well, whoever owns the rights to these tracks now has been re-releasing them over and over in different configurations. This is good though. This is, I think, the complete sort of master takes from those sessions, that songs that were pulled for that debut album. So it's kind of nice. And there's other versions of that comp out there. One last comp we need to talk about, obviously, is Philosopher's Stone. Double album here. I mean, it's 30, yeah, 30 songs. Um, this is a intriguing vault clearing exercise. It was put out in the late '90s. The vast majority of this stuff these are songs that are were left off albums, and kind of, so sort of what Bob Dylan's been doing, and Springsteen and Neil Young, with all these different archival releases. This is the one so far that Van's put out. And again, an artist as prolific as that's going to have a lot of stuff that were left off records. And what's even more intriguing, this is volume 1, and he, as of yet, has not released a volume 2. This came out in 1998, so the majority of this material is from the '70s, which makes it even more intriguing. And then there's kind of a handful on the second disc from the '80s, but the majority is from that. Some of it from that peak '70s period. I was reading about this. There is a Hard Nose Highway was intended initially to be a double album, and so there's a lot of the tracks from those sessions from that were left off because it became a single album. Some tracks are Madame Joy, Contemplation Rose. I mean, those would have been classic Van Morrison songs. Um, and then there was a record after Vita and Fleece that he was kind of starting to work on, I believe, but it didn't put out. And there's a lot of tracks from those sessions on here, which some intriguing stuff. Yeah, is this the treasure trove that you would hope? I'd say overall, no. I think there's a handful of real gems on here. I'll just kind of look through it real quick. Wonderful Remark. I've been talking about that song. Apparently, it's been around for a long time, and there's kind of an 8-minute more acoustic version of that on here, which is really intriguing and interesting. Although I think the released version is the best. Madame Joy, Contemplation Rose. I think those are totally gems. What else on here? Uh, Drum Shanbo Hustle is really good. I like Twilight Zone. Naked in the Jungle, where he kind of gets in some of that funk. I wish he would do more of. It's really good. And Western Plain. I love Western Plain. It's really funky. The Street Only Knew Your Name, which was a song that, drawing a blank on which album, but one of his early '80 albums. Inarticulate Speech of the Heart. I think it's on that one. Much better version on here. Way more rocking, got more guitar. It's just, this is the version of that song. What else? Oh, Stepping Out Queen, which is a great song from Into the Music. There is a Stepping Out Queen Part 2 on here, which is just takes it kind of way down. It's more acoustic, and I think is just as great as Part 1 that's on that. I would have loved it if he had kind of made that an extended track and just sort of somehow edited both together. So that's pretty cool. What else? Anyway, I don't know. Those are the highlights on here for me. But it's a handful of tracks out of 30. So some of this it does sort of just get into kind of more the sort of the R&B type you know, stuff that he gets into sometimes. But there are some gems on here, but not as many as you'd think. For an artist of that caliber, especially pulling stuff from his peak period. But I would be interested in a volume 2 if he ever gets around to it. So, well, all right, guys. I think we're done with Van Morrison for a while. I really appreciate if you've been sticking with me through this whole series. And let's keep it going in the comments on this one, though. What do you guys think? What's your opinion on these live albums, these comps, or just wrapping up on Van Morrison in general? And we will see you next time on Amity Tracks, and it will not be a Van Morrison video. All right, we'll see you later.